And there's one last thing I just want to talk about, and that's about I'd like to compare the lengths of A, B, and C. Well, since A is defined as the semi-major axis, and the major axis is the longest axis always, I think one can argue that A is going to be greater than B. So again, the semi-major axis is always going to be larger than the semi-minor axis. But what about the relationship between A and C? C is the distance from the center to the focus. Well, the focal points of an ellipse are always inside the ellipse. A is on the ellipse. Therefore, A is always the longest. A is always the longest segment. Now, we could have defined A differently, but for our case in this class, A is always the longest segment. And as we learn more about this, we can talk about how other books might define it slightly differently. But for us, A is always the semi-major axis. Therefore, it's always going to be the longest. Now, if that's the longest, which is the shortest? Well, in this picture, I guess it looks like B is a little bit shorter, but let's take a look at some ellipses. Okay, so here's our circle. Here's a few more ellipses, and you can see, and we'll talk a lot about this over the coming days, as we move away from the center, it stretches that ellipse. So if I look in a picture like this, I know that this is the major axis because that's where the foci are. And so I know that this distance here is A, and it is bigger than B. And this distance is B. And this distance here is C. So here it looks like B is greater than C. Let's take a look at this. This again is our major axis. This here is A. And now we have our B here, the semi-minor axis. And this distance here from center to focus is C. In this case, C looks a little bit bigger than B. And let's take a look at our final picture here. Major axis. This distance here is A. This distance here is B. And this here is C. From the center to the focus is C. All right, so as far as which is the shortest length, B or C, it cannot be determined. It depends on the ellipse. So there's no conclusion about which is the shortest segment. A is always the longest. B or C is the shortest depending on the particular ellipse. All right, great.